This is Hawaii, a stunning travel paradise in the heart of the Pacific Ocean. But in the early morning of December 1941, the peaceful beauty of this archipelago was shattered. Pearl Harbor, the largest U.S. naval base in the region, was caught off guard by a surprise attack from Japan. A strike that seemed to mark a resounding victory for the young Imperial Japanese Navy. Yet behind the smoke and ruins, a storm had been awakened. Pearl Harbor was not just a battle. It was a fateful turning point that would drive Japan toward an unavoidable catastrophe. Why did it happen? Many people may be surprised to learn that U.S.-Japanese relations had once been warm. The two nations had been allies in World War I, fighting against Germany. They were also longtime trade partners. The United States, with a booming oil industry since the late 19th century, became a crucial supplier of fuel and industrial raw materials for Japan. By the 1920s and 1930s, the U.S. provided up to 80% of Japan's imported oil. However, tensions gradually grew as Washington became increasingly concerned about Japan's expansionist ambitions. Those concerns were not unfounded. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea. In the early 1930s, Japan seized Manchuria, then expanded its invasion into China in 1937. The conflict reached a peak when Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy in 1940, formally joining the Axis, directly opposed to the Allies led by the United States. Soon after came Japan's move into French Indochina from 1940 to 1941, forcing the U.S. and its allies, Britain and the Netherlands, to impose a complete oil embargo on Japan in the summer of 1941. This was a potentially fatal blow. Japan faced the risk of running out of fuel within roughly 2 years. Now it had only two options: negotiate and make concessions, or launch war to seize resources in Southeast Asia. And what had to happen, happened. In December 1941, Japan opened the Pacific front with a sudden attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. But why Pearl Harbor? Look at the Pacific map in 1941. Pearl Harbor was not the only U.S. base in the region. The Americans also held the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Midway, and Johnston Atoll. After securing a foothold in Indochina, Japan planned to use the area as a springboard to strike the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, and other British territories in Southeast Asia. Those lands promised abundant resources for Japan: oil, coal, food, rubber, and metals. Not only that, controlling them would also secure the vital shipping lanes from Southeast Asia back to Japan, a lifeline for an economy heavily dependent on imports. But if Japan moved against the Dutch East Indies, U.S. forces in the Philippines would not stand aside. And if Japan targeted the Philippines directly, it would have to assault the second-largest American base in the Pacific, while the U.S. could still intervene rapidly from the east. Therefore, the Japanese Navy under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto chose the boldest plan of all: to drive deep and strike a preemptive blow against the main base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The goal of attacking Pearl Harbor was to inflict heavy damage, to paralyze and delay America's counterattack for roughly 6 to 12 months, buying Japan time to seize and fortify newly occupied territories before the enemy recovered. Music now. Let's take a closer look at Hawaii. It lies about 3,200 kilometers from the U.S. West Coast and roughly 6,000 kilometers from Japan. The most important island was Oahu, home to Honolulu, the capital of the archipelago on the southern shore. About 6 miles west of Honolulu is an inlet that cuts deep into the land and divides into 3 sheltered bays. The average depth ranged from 10 to 15 meters, enough for large warships such as aircraft carriers and battleships. This made Pearl Harbor one of the few ports in the Pacific capable of hosting the entire U.S. fleet. In the middle of the harbor stood Ford Island, like a natural pier, providing space for repair facilities, fuel storage, and an airfield, strengthening logistical support. It was also a strategic anchorage where major warships were lined up along what became known as Battleship Row. Despite its size, the harbor entrance was narrow, only about 400 meters wide, and could be defended with coastal guns, anti-submarine nets, and patrol vessels. On a wider scale, Pearl Harbor was shielded by low mountain ranges on Oahu. This not only reduced the impact of strong winds and storms, but also created advantageous positions for lookout stations. Specifically, 6 radar stations were deployed at strategic points, using the SCR-270 system, among the earliest U.S. early warning radars, capable under ideal conditions of detecting aircraft from up to 240 kilometers away. In addition, there were numerous visual observation posts using telescopes and signals to detect ships or aircraft at closer range. Airfields across the island allowed patrol aircraft to monitor surrounding waters. The U.S. Pacific Fleet also had another base at Lahaina on Maui that could reinforce Oahu if needed. In total, defending the islands was not only the U.S. Pacific Fleet, among the most powerful fleets in the world, but also a garrison of around 43,000 troops and about 400 military aircraft. With such geography and layered defenses, the Americans could hardly imagine the harbor would be attacked, and from the air. As a result, commanders on the island focused more on internal sabotage than an external assault. But from Japan's perspective, attacking Pearl Harbor was far from easy. It required meticulous preparation. Japan relied on 3 main aircraft types: the Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, the Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber, and the Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber. With the ability to carry bombs or torpedoes, weighing up to 800 kilograms, these aircraft were the spearhead meant to strike battleships and aircraft carriers. The dive bombers would attack targets both onshore and at sea. The Zero, fast and highly maneuverable, would secure air superiority, strafe airfields, and destroy aircraft on the ground to prevent them from taking off and counterattacking. Then came a major technical challenge. The Japanese Type 91 aerial torpedo normally dived to around 20 meters after entering the water, then rose and stabilized at a running depth of about 5 to 10 meters. But Pearl Harbor's main anchorage was shallow, only about 10 to 15 meters deep, meaning such torpedoes could easily hit the seabed during the initial dive. To solve this, Japanese engineers developed an improved version with wooden stabilizing fins, reducing the initial dive and keeping the torpedo running at about 3 to 5 meters below the surface. Meanwhile, B-5N pilots trained intensively to release torpedoes from just 10 to 20 meters altitude at low speed and precise angles, coordinating smoothly in large attack formations together with all 3 aircraft types. By this point, the average skill level of Japanese naval aviators was higher than that of their American counterparts. No plan can succeed without intelligence. In May 1941, a spy was sent to the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. At the time, around 83,000 people of Japanese descent lived there, and about 35,000 held dual citizenship. This allowed the intelligence officer to gather extensive information about the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and the distribution of air power across the island. Everything was sent back to Tokyo via diplomatic codes, enabling Yamamoto's command to monitor the enemy closely. On November 26, 1941, local time, a special strike force of the Imperial Japanese Navy departed Hitokapu Bay and sailed east. They were known as the Kido Butai, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The force included 6 aircraft carriers carrying more than 400 aircraft, along with battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support ships. To maintain absolute secrecy, the task force took a long northern route through the cold, foggy waters of the North Pacific, near rarely traveled sea lanes, approaching Hawaii from the north. Throughout the voyage, the fleet avoided radio transmissions to prevent U.S. signal intelligence from detecting them. They received only one-way communications from headquarters, using civilian or wide-band military frequencies. Ships communicated with each other by manual methods such as flags and signal lights. Any unlucky vessel that encountered Kido Butai would be sunk immediately. For U.S. ships, Japanese orders were strict. If encountered before December 6th, the mission would be considered compromised and would be aborted. If encountered on December 6th, it would depend on circumstances. But if encountered after December 6th, it would be too late to turn back. The target must be destroyed at all costs. Fortunately for the attackers, they met no ships throughout the journey. At 3:30 a.m. on the day of the attack, when they were about 370 kilometers north of Oahu, Nagumo ordered the fleet to battle stations. At 6:20 a.m., pilots received the launch order. A total of 183 aircraft took off in a pre-planned sequence and formation. The first wave, the decisive strike intended to exploit America's unpreparedness, was led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. However, Japan nearly lost its advantage. At 7:20 a.m., when the aircraft were still about 220 kilometers away, they were detected by a radar station at Opana Point on northern Oahu. The operators reported a massive formation on the radar screen, but they did not specify the exact number of aircraft. The interception center mistakenly assumed it was a scheduled flight of 6 B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland. The bearing of the incoming Japanese aircraft and the planned route of the B-17s were close, only a few degrees apart. This fatal misinterpretation cost Pearl Harbor at least 20 minutes of early warning. The Japanese formation continued toward Oahu, shooting down several American aircraft. At least one managed to send a radio warning, though it was unclear and fragmented, and the crucial information was not processed in time. The Japanese chose to attack on a Sunday morning, when many soldiers were asleep or on leave. They also calculated their approach carefully. Pilots came in from the north, using the island's mountain ridges as cover to reduce engine noise and avoid early detection by ground observers. As a result, when the first gunshots, explosions, and sirens sounded, most American sailors only then realized they were under attack. The first airstrike began at 7:48 a.m. The Naval Air Station at Kaneohe was among the first targets. Almost simultaneously, Zero fighters flew low to strafe Wheeler Field, the U.S. Army Air Force's main airbase on central Oahu, where about 140 P-40 and P-36 fighters were parked. American aircraft had been lined up closely to prevent sabotage, but this effectively served them up to the attackers. Around 80 aircraft were destroyed there. Next, Hickam Field near Pearl Harbor was hit. Dive bombers attacked hangars and fuel facilities, destroying dozens of aircraft. But the true weight of the strike lay with the slower B-5N torpedo bombers carrying heavy weapons. Exploiting surprise, they focused on the most valuable targets, the battleships. The first ship hit was USS Utah, an outdated dreadnought-type battleship used as a training ship, moored near Ford Island. Several torpedoes were launched at her. 2 struck, causing her to capsize and sink quickly. Another torpedo missed and hit the light cruiser USS Raleigh beside her, severely damaging it. Other torpedo bombers continued circling the harbor in search of higher-value targets. The battleship USS Pennsylvania was intended, but a P-2 torpedo veered and instead struck the nearby ship USS Oglala. In a bizarre twist, another torpedo passed beneath Oglala's hull and hit the light cruiser USS Helena, causing heavy damage. The blast tore Oglala apart, and she soon capsized. Most of the remaining torpedo planes swung south and then turned back into ideal attack positions along Battleship Row. USS Oklahoma and USS West Virginia, on the outer side, were two of the best targets. Torpedoes slammed in at nearly right angles. Some planes redirected to attack USS California and USS Nevada. Oklahoma was hit repeatedly and capsized within minutes, taking hundreds of sailors with her. West Virginia was struck by multiple torpedoes, badly damaged, and partially sank, but did not capsize. Then came the armor-piercing bombs, modified 410mm shells converted into bombs, capable of punching through decks or superstructures and detonating deep inside ships. West Virginia was hit. A bomb pierced near the port side, sparking intense fires. Another struck the aft turret area. It did not explode but disabled a gun and damaged seaplanes. Meanwhile, as California's crew struggled to control flooding from earlier torpedo hits, an armor-piercing bomb struck, killing dozens and starting a severe fire that ended efforts to save the ship. The most tragic was USS Arizona. A bomb penetrated into her forward ammunition magazine. Seconds later, at 8:06 a.m., a catastrophic explosion split the ship apart. About 1,177 men died aboard Arizona, nearly half of all American fatalities that day. As alarms blared, many U.S. soldiers jolted awake, threw on clothes and ran to battle stations. But defenses were not prepared. Some guns were unmanned. Ammunition lockers were still locked, and bringing the batteries into action took precious time. Even so, there were moments of individual heroism. Dory Miller, a cook aboard USS West Virginia, rushed to a gun position. After helping move wounded men and pass ammunition, he took control of a .50 caliber machine gun and fired at enemy aircraft for roughly 15 minutes, reportedly shooting down a Japanese plane. Two U.S. Army Air Corps pilots, George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, were also awakened abruptly. They raced to Halewa Airfield, dodging Japanese strafing along the way. Minutes later, they became among the first American pilots to take off in P-40 fighters and managed to shoot down several enemy aircraft, though their actions were too small to change the battle's outcome. Music, the second wave, began about an hour later, with roughly 170 aircraft. By then, U.S. anti-air defenses were starting to respond, and a few fighters were airborne. Low and slow torpedo runs had become too risky, so the focus shifted to dive bombing. Japanese planes finished off damaged ships in the harbor, dropping 250-kilogram bombs. USS Nevada, the only battleship able to move, tried to limp toward the harbor entrance and immediately became the target of repeated dive bomber attacks. Because Nevada was under repair and had empty ammunition spaces, she avoided Arizona's fate. But under heavy bombing, her superstructure burned fiercely. In the end, her crew deliberately ran her aground to prevent her from sinking and blocking the channel. By around 9:05 a.m., dive bombers and torpedo planes turned to attack remaining airfields, destroying more hangars and aircraft on the ground. Zero fighters circled to shoot down any American planes attempting to take off, then shifted to secondary targets such as workshops, ammunition depots, and destroyers in the harbor. The attack ended at about 9:45 a.m., as Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers, leaving the harbor shrouded in smoke and fire. In just 90 minutes, 2,403 Americans were killed, including 68 civilians, and more than 1,000 were wounded. 18 ships were sunk or heavily damaged, including several battleships. Of roughly 400 aircraft in Hawaii, 188 were destroyed and 159 damaged. Japanese losses were far smaller. Dozens of aircraft shot down, with pilots killed or missing, and additional aircraft damaged, some beyond repair. Tactically, it was a clear victory for Japan. Strategically, however, it may have been a disastrous move. Japan had prioritized sinking U.S. battleships and invested enormous resources into building super battleships like the Yamato class. But as history would soon show, battleships played a limited role in later Pacific operations. Instead, targets like aircraft carriers, shipyards, repair facilities, fuel depots, submarine bases, and command infrastructure, many of which were not destroyed, proved far more decisive. Pearl Harbor remained a crucial logistical hub, allowing the U.S. Navy to recover quickly and launch counterattacks. More importantly, the attack created an enemy Japan could not defeat. In 1941, the United States was deeply divided over whether to enter World War II. Isolationist movements such as the America First Committee argued that America should stay out of conflicts in Europe and Asia and focus on domestic issues. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and interventionists supported aiding the Allies. But after Pearl Harbor, that division vanished. The nation united around a single goal: defeat Japan and the Axis. Recruitment centers across the country filled with volunteers. The U.S. expanded its forces dramatically. Citizens supported war drives by buying war bonds and donating materials. The government converted civilian factories to produce weapons, warships, aircraft, and tanks, producing hundreds of thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, and thousands of ships during the war, far surpassing Japan's industrial capacity. Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant, and the world was about to witness its power in the battles to come.